The Kentucky State Archives preserves a single water-stained document that has left historians unsettled for more than 170 years. Filed quietly under unresolved cases, 1847, it recounts the disappearance of Jeremiah O'Brien, an Irish immigrant farmer who seemed to vanish into the fog of Harrison County without leaving so much as a footprint behind. But here's the detail that has never stopped troubling researchers. It wasn't just the absence of Jeremiah's body or the peculiar behavior of his wife Catherine in the days that followed. What chilled investigators was an inventory list tucked away in the county clerk's office, recording the unexplained weight gain of the O'Brien livestock during that very same period. Gains so dramatic, so unnatural, that they contradicted every known agricultural principle of the time. Local newspapers avoided printing the story in full. The sheriff's final report was sealed by court order. And even now, more than a century later, the mere mention of the O'Brien name in parts of Harrison County is enough to make older residents murmur prayers and cross themselves. Tonight, we'll piece together the fragments that remain the whispers, the half-buried evidence, the choices made on that isolated farm. And perhaps, together, we'll understand why this case was buried so deeply. Before we turn to Catherine O'Brien and the secret that changed everything we thought we knew about survival in 1847. I'll pause here. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and ring that little notification bell. Because stories like this, dark forgotten and almost too disturbing to be true, are the very reason we dig through America's shadowed past. And while you're here, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? A small town, a big city, somewhere along the Ohio River itself, perhaps. We love connecting with fellow mystery seekers across the country. The trail that leads us to the truth does not begin with Catherine's crime, if indeed it was a crime at all. It begins with her desperation, with the impossible choice that would transform a hungry Irish immigrant woman into something far more dangerous, far more resourceful than anyone in Kentucky could have imagined. Picture Harrison County in 1847 rolling hills, shrouded in morning fog, tobacco fields fading into rocky ridges, and lonely cabins dotting the landscape like secrets waiting to be uncovered. This land had become a refuge for Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Famine. Their ships carried them up the Ohio River, promising opportunity, soil, and survival. But the price of that promise was heavier than most could bear. Catherine Flanagan arrived 3 years earlier, her passage secured by a marriage contract arranged through the Catholic Church in Louisville. At 24, she carried with her the fierce determination of someone who had watched her homeland collapse into hunger and disease. Her fiery red hair, kept tightly pinned beneath a worn bonnet, had earned her the nickname Firecat among Irish dock workers. But what lingered in people's minds wasn't her hair, it was her stare. Catherine had a way of looking directly through you, as though she already knew the thoughts you hadn't dared to speak. That marriage contract bound her to Jeremiah O'Brien, a man 15 years older. He claimed to own 40 fertile acres and a thriving pig operation. But when Catherine stepped onto the farm, reality was far grimmer. 12 starving pigs, a sagging barn, and a 2-room cabin whose roof leaked whenever the west wind blew. The so-called 40 acres were mostly rocky hills, ill-suited to anything but grazing, and the mortgage was already 3 months overdue. As for Jeremiah himself, he was worse than the land. A heavy-set man with grey already threading his hair, his hands shook each morning until whiskey steadied them. He spent most of his days in Harrison County's Irish Quarter, gambling and drinking away the few coins Catherine managed to earn. Neighbors whispered he hadn't always been this way, that something in the Mexican-American War had broken him. Whatever the truth, by the time Catherine arrived, he was a man hollowed out by vice and resentment. So Catherine took the burden of survival upon herself. She mended the fences patched. The roof argued with merchants for more time on the debts, and poured her strength into the one thing that might save them, the pigs. Rising before dawn, she fed them with scraps. She carefully measured, cleaned their pens by hand, and studied their growth late into the night by candlelight. Her neighbors, American-born families who eyed the Irish with suspicion, begrudgingly admitted she worked harder than most men. And under her care, the herd began to thrive. Catherine had grown up on her father's farm in County Cork and carried an instinctive knowledge of livestock that impressed even the most experienced farmers. By late 1846, their herd had grown to 23 healthy pigs, and Catherine had forged steady trade with butchers in Cynthiana and Georgetown. But success only deepened the fractures in her marriage. For every dollar Catherine brought in, Jeremiah found a way to spend too. His debts to gamblers mounted, his temper soured, and the more he drank, the more he resented his wife's competence. Even among his fellow Irishmen, Jeremiah became an outcast. Catherine learned to adapt in silence. She began hiding money in mason jars beneath the cabin floorboards, keeping careful mental records of every coin. The farm's survival depended on her, and she knew it. But what she could not have known, what no one in Harrison County could have suspected, was how far desperation would soon push her, and how the story of her pigs would become one of the darkest mysteries ever whispered in Kentucky. The tension between Catherine and Jeremiah worsened as 1846 dragged on, swelling like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Through that bitter winter, their arguments grew sharper, their silences colder. Jeremiah began speaking endlessly of California, where the recent discovery of gold promised a new life for men willing to risk the journey. He imagined selling the farm, pocketing the cash, and starting over far away. Catherine, who had fought tooth and nail to turn the farm into something worth keeping, resisted fiercely. Their shouting matches broke the quiet of their secluded hollow, carrying through the foggy mornings when neighbors were just beginning their chores. By the start of 1847, people noticed changes in both of them. Catherine had grown thin, her once bright smile replaced by a guarded wariness that unsettled even her fellow Irish families. Dark circles shadowed her green eyes, the marks of sleepless nights. She carried herself like a woman braced for impact. Jeremiah, meanwhile, became erratic, swaggering into the tavern with unexplained money, spinning wild stories about grand futures that no one believed. The close-knit Irish community in Harrison County, bound by language, religion, and the constant reminder that they were outsiders, began pulling away from the O'Briens. Catherine's pride kept her from seeking help. Jeremiah's arrogance drove others off. Even Father Michael O'Connell, the traveling priest who ministered to scattered Catholic families, noticed the strain. He later testified that Catherine had asked him pointed questions about the church's stance on self-defense and the protection of property. When pressed in later years, he would only reply that he had told her to pray for guidance and to remember that God sees all things, even those done in the shadows. The O'Brien farm sat at the end of a lonely dirt road branching off from the main route between Cynthiana and Millersburg. dense woods wrapped around it like a cloak. At first, Catherine had welcomed the seclusion, but by 1847 that privacy felt like isolation. The Kellermans, their nearest neighbors, lived almost a mile away, across rugged ground. Whatever happened in that hollow rarely carried to outside ears. That detail would become crucial when investigators tried to untangle what took place there in March of 1847. As winter yielded to spring, the pigs flourished under Catherine's steady care. She now had 29 healthy animals, and local butchers were eager to buy the herd. For the first time, real stability seemed possible. Debts could be cleared, the barn repaired, the farm expanded. Catherine dared to hope, but fate intervened in the form of a rusted tobacco tin. Hidden beneath Jeremiah's side of the bed, it contained letters that shattered Catherine's fragile optimism. They were from a Louisville land speculator, laying out negotiations for the sale of the O'Brien farm. Jeremiah had been planning for months to sell everything, pocket the money, and vanish westward. Worse still, the letters revealed his intention to travel with another woman, Mary Brennan, a young widow from Georgetown. The betrayal stung sharper than any slap. Catherine had given her strength, her very body, to rebuild what Jeremiah had squandered. And now he would leave her with nothing, not even the legal right to contest the sale. Under Kentucky law, wives had no claim to property in their husband's name, no matter how much labor they had poured into it. March 15th, 1847 dawned grey and heavy, the air thick and still. Old locals swore such weather was a warning of trouble. Catherine rose early as usual, feeding the pigs and checking a sow due to farrow. Mist clung to the trees, swallowing sound until the world seemed unnaturally quiet. She had hardly slept. The decision had been forged in those long, sleepless hours. She could not allow Jeremiah to take everything. Not after all she had endured. When Jeremiah stumbled out of the cabin around 10, whiskey already blurring his step, Catherine was waiting. His shirt was stained, his hair uncombed, his eyes red-rimmed with drink. He muttered something about riding into town and moved toward the stable. "We need to talk, Jeremiah." Her voice stopped him. She stood by the pig pen, a bucket of scraps in her hand, her red hair glinting beneath her bonnet. The tone made him wary. Talk about what he slurred. Without a word, Catherine produced the letters from her apron. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed, anger flashing as recognition sank in. "You had no right to go through my things," he snapped. "You mean your plans to sell this farm? To run off with Mary Brennan?" Her voice was steady, even as rage simmered beneath. 3 years I've worked to turn this place into something worth having, while you drank it away. And now you mean to throw it all away." Jeremiah stepped closer, fists clenched. "My name's on the deed. My signature's on the mortgage. You're just the wife, Catherine. You own nothing." The words cut like blows. Still, Catherine kept her composure. "I won't let you do it," she said. Jeremiah laughed harshly. "You won't let me. I already signed the papers. McReynolds is coming tomorrow to finish it. By next week, I'll be in California, and you can fend for yourself." "What about the pigs?" Catherine asked, nodding toward the pen where the animals grunted contentedly. "What about everything we've built?" "We," Jeremiah sneered. "You did the work, and I was supposed to be grateful. I'm done pretending. This marriage was anything but a mistake." His hand rose, the familiar threat of a blow. But this time, Catherine didn't flinch. She looked at him with cold calculation, and for the first time, he hesitated. "You're not leaving, Jeremiah," she said quietly. Something in her tone pierced even his whiskey haze. He frowned, uncertain. "What are you talking about? I said you're not leaving. This farm stays in the family. And so do you." His anger reignited. "You can't stop me. You're nothing but a peasant who should be grateful any man would have you." He lunged. His hand came down to strike, but Catherine was ready. She sidestepped and snatched up the heavy wooden feeding ladle from the bucket at her feet. And in that instant, the balance of power shifted forever. The motion of her hand was smooth and practiced a motion that had been imagined and rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times. The wooden spoon struck Jeremiah's temple, a dull, rough punch that was unusual in the morning silence. He stepped back, his eyes widening in surprise rather than pain. For a moment, Catherine thought he might fall and end the confrontation. But Jeremiah braced himself against the fence post, brought his fingers to his head, and saw blood on his hands. "You fool," he said half in disbelief. "You actually hit me. I warned you," Catherine said, the spoon still in her hand. Her heart was pounding, but her voice held the steadiness of months of tension. "I told you not to go." Jeremiah straightened, wiping the blood from his mouth, and saw the anger rising in his face. His hands were shaking, but this time for something else, not just the wine. "You will regret it," he growled, advancing with slow, deliberate steps. "I will teach you what happens to wives who forget their place." As he approached, Catherine saw something that turned her blood to ice. In his right hand was a straw hook, a sharp instrument that could be turned into a deadly weapon if swung hard enough. The intent in his eyes was clear. In that moment, Catherine knew coldly that this argument could only end in a death. Everything seemed to slow down. The scene was drawn out, frame by frame, in the moments of life and death. She saw Jeremiah raise the hook, his face contorted with fury. The morning light reflected furtively off the metal. Her nose picked up the scent of pig manure, damp earth smells that would be seared into her memory for the rest of her life. And she saw clearly the path she had to take to survive. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the squealing of pigs and the drip of water from the broken roof. Catherine stood still for a long moment, then heard Jeremiah's body fall to the side of the pig pen. The iron hook lay a few feet away, soaked with moisture. Blood had seeped from beneath his head into the mud, thick but not as heavy as she had expected. The second blow with the wooden spoon hitting him behind the left ear as he fell had killed him almost instantly. His eyes were wide open, his mouth hanging open as if he had not yet understood what had happened. Catherine was shaking a mixture of adrenaline and terror. She dropped the spoon, hugging herself to stop the shaking. Reality hit her. She was alone in a foreign land with her husband's body, without a single witness to prove she had acted in self-defense. And Kentucky law in those days was not kind to a wife who had killed her husband. Her words would be worthless to an all-American jury, already viewing Irish immigrants with suspicion. The practical obstacles were also numerous. Jeremiah weighed nearly 200 pounds, and Catherine could not move the body by herself. She could not leave him there. The Kellerman children sometimes wandered in, and the traveling priest could stop by at any moment. She could not bury him alone, and besides, she had no legal way to explain his sudden disappearance. Then she noticed movement around her. The pigs had gathered near the fence, attracted by the scent of blood and the unusualness of their breakfast. Their small eyes watched her with a kind of expectant attention. Several of the larger males began to make low purrs, the sound they made when they were about to eat. A thought flashed through her mind, undramatic but cold, like a solved farm problem. Pigs were omnivores, efficient at digesting organic matter. Irish farmers had long known that they could process organic waste with less formality than any other method. The idea should have made her shudder. Instead, Catherine viewed it through the same pragmatic lens that had kept her house for 3 years. She circled her husband's body, looking considering. The pen was large enough for the job, the fence high enough to block the view if anyone walked past. These, in that moment, were not elaborate plans but cold facts, snippets of information needed to make the next decision. The nearest farm was far enough away that no one would question the sounds of pigs feeding at this hour. If a neighbor happened to hear anything unusual, they would simply assume Catherine was carrying out her daily chores. That thought steadied her nerves. The real challenge wasn't secrecy, it was the weight of Jeremiah's body. But Catherine had been carrying heavy feed sacks and wrestling stubborn hogs for years. Her arms and back had grown strong through necessity, and desperation now granted her a strength she never thought possible. Even so, the grim thought of dragging Jeremiah in pieces flickered through her mind, and she quickly forced it away. Dismemberment made her stomach twist. And yet, as she stood there in the morning mist, a plan crystallized. Feeding him to the pigs didn't just solve one problem, it solved them all. His body would vanish without trace, swallowed by the very animals that kept her alive. His sudden disappearance could be explained by the story he himself had planted in the community that he had always dreamed of leaving for California. If anyone asked, she could simply say he had gone ahead of her, chasing gold and opportunity. And meanwhile, her pigs, her only true security, would thrive. Tell me, friends, what would you have done in her place? Faced with a husband's corpse, a law stacked against you, and a farm that was your only lifeline, would you have thought of the pigs? Or would you have run? The decision brought Catherine an unexpected calm. She had always been practical by nature. This was just another problem that demanded a practical solution. The morality of it all felt distant drowned beneath the immediate need to survive. She returned to the cabin and changed into her oldest work dress, one already frayed and patch-stained from years of labor. From the kitchen, she gathered sharp knives, a coil of rope, and an old canvas tarp once used for machinery. Before stepping outside again, she pulled down Jeremiah's bottle of whiskey and drank deeply, letting the burn steel her trembling resolve. The work was every bit as brutal as she feared. The pigs stirred restlessly at the scent, their squeals rising and falling as if urging her on. Catherine labored for hours, dragging, lifting, cutting, pausing to catch her breath and wipe the sweat from her brow. Each time she stopped, her eyes darted toward the distant tree line, alert to the possibility of someone approaching. No one did. By evening, the pigs were sated, their bellies full in a way they hadn't been in months, and Jeremiah O'Brien. He was gone, reduced to nothing more than a dark stain in the mud, quickly hidden under hay and manure. Catherine burned what little remained of him, his clothes, his papers, his keepsakes. The ashes mingled with ordinary firewood, leaving no sign of anything unusual. That night, she sat awake by the fire, her body aching and her mind whirling. She felt no guilt for striking him down. He would have killed her if she hadn't acted first. What troubled her more was the method of disposal, the unnatural intimacy of feeding her husband to the pigs. Yet even that unease faded as her practical instincts reminded her she had survived. In the days that followed, Catherine wove her story with quiet confidence. To neighbors, she explained that Jeremiah had finally taken the chance he always talked about, heading west to California in search of gold. They nodded, some surprised that he had gone without farewells. But the tale matched what they already knew of his restless nature. 2 weeks later, Father O'Connell came to the farm, suspicion flickering in his eyes. He asked Catherine pointedly why Jeremiah had left so suddenly. She met his gaze without flinching, repeating her story. An opportunity came, she told him, and he left quickly with other men bound for California. He promised to send word once he was settled. The priest frowned, unconvinced, but found no proof to challenge her. The real struggle came not from gossip or questions, but from Jeremiah's debts. His gambling had been worse than Catherine ever realized, and creditors descended like vultures the moment they heard he was gone. To keep them at bay, Catherine was forced to sell most of her pigs earlier than planned. Yet, she carefully held back her strongest animals, the very pigs that had helped her in those first desperate hours. And those pigs thrived. Neighbors couldn't help but notice. Catherine's herd, though smaller, grew to an astonishing size and vigor. Their coats gleamed, their bodies grew thick with muscle, and the behavior brimmed with an energy uncommon among hogs. When asked her secret, Catherine smiled and credited her new feeding methods. But she never revealed the truth. By midsummer, the farm looked transformed. Without Jeremiah's drinking and gambling to drain her, Catherine flourished. She rebuilt fences, expanded the pig pen, even added a new kitchen extension to the cabin. Most importantly, she made the final payment on the mortgage securing ownership of the land in her own name at last. Mary Kellerman, her neighbor, remarked more than once on the change. Catherine smiled more, carried herself with confidence, her face no longer pinched with worry. Yet alongside the admiration, whispers began. Some said her pigs were unnatural in their size, that Catherine's protectiveness over them bordered on obsession. She spoke to them in Gaelic, fussed over them like children, and refused offers that would have made her wealthy. And then came Thomas McReynolds, the well-dressed land speculator from Louisville. He had expected to meet Jeremiah, ready to finalize the sale of the O'Brien farm. Instead, he found Catherine waiting steady as stone. Producing a letter she claimed was from her husband in California, she informed him that the farm was no longer for sale. Jeremiah, she said, had changed his mind. What do you think, dear listener? Would you have believed her? Or would you like? McReynolds have wondered just what was happening behind the fences of that quiet Kentucky farm. The letter Catherine produced was convincing. It bore Jeremiah's handwriting, complete with familiar details that seemed to authenticate it beyond question. Yet, Thomas McReynolds, the seasoned land speculator from Louisville, couldn't quiet the unease in his chest. At the tavern in Cynthiana, he told the men gathered over whiskey, "I've been in business 15 years and I've never seen a man reverse himself so completely. Jeremiah O'Brien wanted California more than life itself. For months he spoke of nothing else. And now, suddenly, he clings to this farm. That doubt drove him to linger in Harrison County, asking quiet questions. What he learned only deepened his suspicion. No one had seen Jeremiah depart. Catherine claimed he had slipped away early one morning while she still slept, but not a single member of the local Irish community. People who knew Jeremiah's boisterous habits well had received a farewell or a letter. More troubling still, his horse remained in the stable untouched. What sort of man walked to California, leaving his best animal behind? When McReynolds pressed Catherine on these inconsistencies, she stood her ground with unnerving calm. Jeremiah left on foot to meet travelers in Georgetown, she explained smoothly. He would buy a horse and supplies there before heading west. As for his silence, well, Jeremiah was careless with letters, always had been, and the letter she claimed it had been hand-delivered by another Irish immigrant returning from California, which accounted for the absence of postal markings. On paper, it all checked out. The supposed cancellation of the farm's sale stood firm, and with Catherine having paid off the mortgage, her legal claim to the land was ironclad. After a week of fruitless probing, McReynolds returned to Louisville. But he left threads of curiosity, dangling contacts who continued to watch the O'Brien farm with quiet interest. Yet Catherine's greatest challenge wasn't McReynolds. It was her own community. Whispers reached Father O'Connell's ears. Reports that Catherine had grown cold, calculating, aloof in ways that unsettled her neighbors. She no longer joined the Irish women's gatherings, nor lent her hand to community projects. She only left her farm when business required it. More disturbing still were the stories about her pigs. Children swore they saw her speaking to them in Gaelic for hours at a stretch. Some even claimed the dialect was strange, harder than the Irish their parents knew. And always, she seemed to be feeding them. At night before dawn, with portions far beyond what a normal herd could consume. Uneasy, Father O'Connell rode out to her farm again in early August, ostensibly to check on her soul, though in truth he came to see whether the rumors held weight. He found her in the garden, which had expanded dramatically since his last visit. Strange herbs sprouted in neat rows, mingled with familiar vegetables. She greeted him politely, but without warmth. Unlike most Irish Catholic women, Catherine offered no effusive hospitality to her priest. "I've been concerned for you, my child," Father O'Connell began as they walked toward the cabin. "Life alone here cannot be easy." "I'm managing well, Father," she replied. Then with a coolness that made him pause. Better than when Jeremiah was here. There was no grief in her voice, no longing. Only dismissal. The priest pressed gently. "Have you heard from him?" Not directly, Catherine answered, her eyes drifting toward the pig pen. "But I know he's well." Likely too busy prospecting to write, O'Connell noticed her gaze linger on the animals. The pigs clustered by the fence, watching her intently, their massive bodies healthier than any he'd seen in Kentucky. It unsettled him how their eyes followed her, how she seemed more aware of their presence than his. He voiced the neighbors' concerns about her withdrawal, her long absences from the community. Catherine shrugged them off. "The farm demands my time. I've no hours to waste on gossip." Technically, her words were proper, but her manner told another story, guarded, defensive, almost secretive. and when he asked to see the letter from Jeremiah, she produced it readily. The handwriting matched, yes, but the tone rang false, overly detailed in some places, strangely vague in others, as though crafted by someone imitating Jeremiah rather than Jeremiah himself. That night, O'Connell confided to Patrick Kellerman. "There is something wrong at the O'Brien farm," he murmured. "I cannot yet prove it. But that woman hides something. And I fear, Patrick, that when it comes to light, we will wish we had acted sooner." And then came the drought. August scourged Harrison County with unseasonable cruelty. Creeks shrank to stagnant pools. Gardens withered to dust. Livestock grew gaunt and restless. Fear spread like smoke as families worried how they would survive the coming winter. But Catherine's farm, it thrived. Her garden was lush, unnaturally so green where others browned. Her pigs grew fat, sleek, and strong, untouched by the heat or scarcity. Neighbors whispered of it in awe and unease, for it seemed her land and her animals existed under a different law of nature altogether. Tell me, dear listeners, if you were one of those neighbors watching your fields fail while Catherine's flourished, would you believe it was luck, hard work? Or would you too begin to wonder what dark bargain she might have struck? People began to whisper about the obvious difference between Catherine's farm and the rest of Harrison County. "It's not natural," Sarah Brennan complained as her fields dried up from the drought. "Whose pigs could be so fat in a drought year? She must have some secret feed. But where did it come from? And how did she pay for it?" The remarkable thing was that no merchant in Cynthiana or Georgetown had ever recorded Catherine buying more feed. No corn, no barley, no feed of any kind. Yet her pigs grew fat and strong as if the drought had never existed. By the end of August, Thomas McReynolds was back in Harrison this time, bringing with him a young lawyer from Louisville named Jonathan Hayes. McReynolds was still convinced that there was something fishy about Jeremiah's departure. He hoped Hayes could find a legal loophole to challenge Catherine's ownership of the farm. For days, the two men roamed the area, asking neighbors, looking up documents in the county courthouse. But the deeper they dug, the more the mystery grew. One suspicious detail: no one had actually seen Jeremiah leave. Only Catherine's word. His horse was still in the stable, too absurd for a trip all the way to California. More important were the financial transactions that had occurred shortly after Jeremiah disappeared. Look. Hayes spread out the papers on the hotel table. Just 3 days after she said Jeremiah left, Catherine paid off the entire mortgage. Where did that money come from? McReynolds frowned. She said she had sold the pigs, but the timing was too tight. Who would have taken care of it after Jeremiah left selling so much in a few days, and no one knew who the buyer was? Does that make sense? Hayes also found records of Jeremiah's massive debts, mostly gambling debts. He had been forced to pay them back by his creditors in the winter of 1846. Yet, within 2 weeks of his trip, all the debts had suddenly disappeared, paid in full. Where did the money come from? The two decided to confront Catherine directly. It was a hot August day, the sun scorching the parched fields. Yet Catherine's garden was lush and green, with vegetables growing in an unimaginable way. She was crouching over her vegetable patch when they arrived. Seeing McReynolds, Catherine lost her patience for a moment, but smiled and greeted him anyway. Mrs. O'Brien Hayes began. "We have some questions to ask about your husband's assets and business." "My husband's business?" Catherine said curtly, still hoeing the tree. "I don't interfere, but you paid his debts." McReynolds interrupted, his voice strained. "You wrote off the mortgage, paid off all your gambling debts." "Where did that money come from, Mom?" Catherine straightened, brushing dirt off her hands, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I told you, I sold the pigs. Jeremiah told me to get things in order before he left." Hayes flipped through his notes. "In less than a week, you sold 21 pigs to buyers no one here has ever seen. Don't you think that's strange?" Catherine looked at them, her blue eyes flashing with anger. "It seems strange to me that grown men have the leisure to pry into a woman's private affairs. My husband gave his permission." The buyer was a merchant on his way down to Louisville. That's all. McReynolds could stand it no longer, and he stepped forward, lowering his voice, but enunciating each word. "I don't believe Jeremiah ever left this place, Mrs. O'Brien. I believe something happened to him right here on this farm." The air seemed thick. Catherine's expression did not change, but Hayes noticed that her hands were trembling slightly. Behind her, the pigs had drawn up against the fence, their dark eyes fixed on the conversation. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. McReynolds," Catherine said, her voice icy. "Do you have any proof? Proof that your story doesn't fit?" McReynolds growled. "Proof that the money fell from the sky. Proof that no one ever saw Jeremiah leave. And I have a letter from my husband from California." Catherine interrupted, a faint smile on her face. "I have witnesses that he talked about going west. I have legal papers to prove it." "Is that enough?" Hayes changed his tone, softening his tone. "Sometimes, Mom, accidents happen. People panic and decide to cover it up instead of telling the truth. If something happens, you should say it now." Catherine sneered. "How could a little woman like me hurt a big man like Jeremiah? If you have nothing else to do, let me go back to my land and my pigs." She pointed to the pig pen. Indeed, the pigs were bigger and stronger than any in Kentucky. McReynolds narrowed his eyes. "They are beautiful pigs. But what have you been feeding them to keep them so healthy in such a terrible year?" "Just leftovers, kitchen scraps, and a few farming secrets my father taught me from Ireland," Catherine replied, her voice calm. "They are special secrets," Hayes said quietly. "I have never seen pigs grow so well." Catherine's smile froze. Perhaps Kentucky farmers should learn a little from the Irish. As they were about to leave, Hayes stopped. In the corner of the pen, hidden in the straw, was a glint of metal. He bent down to look closely. It was a man's belt buckle, rusted but still in good shape. Mrs. O'Brien Hayes said softly, "You should clean up around the pig pen. There's metal there. It's dangerous to the animals." Catherine turned to look. For a brief moment, her expression changed. Fear was palpable. But then she regained her composure. "Thank you, I'll take care of it," she said evenly. As McReynolds and Hayes walked away, they heard Catherine whispering softly to the pigs behind them. The strange sounds, not like normal conversation, echoed in the hot August afternoon air. "Have you noticed more and more details are revealed that make us wonder, where did Jeremiah go? Or rather, did he never leave this land? Do you suspect, like McReynolds, that the pigs are directly related to that mysterious disappearance. The sound Catherine made in the darkness was strange, not like a normal conversation, but almost an intimate whisper, like a real conversation with pigs. McReynolds and Hayes suddenly quickened their pace for no apparent reason. Did you see the way she reacted when she saw the belt buckle Hayes whispered when they were out of earshot? I saw it. McReynolds replied, his voice heavy. And I think we both know who it belongs to. That evening, they arranged to meet Father O'Connell and Patrick Kellerman at the town tavern. The four of them sat down, and the pieces of doubt began to piece together into a terrifying picture. Father O'Connell said, "First, I have observed. Catherine often makes very large fires at night, much larger than the usual rubbish burning, and some children have reported seeing her working in the pig pen late at night. That is unusual." Kellerman nodded, his face pale. "My youngest son swears he saw her talking to the pigs as if thanking them for something. He was so scared he couldn't sleep." Hayes leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid we have to consider a possibility. Catherine O'Brien killed her husband, and she managed to get rid of the body so that no one would find a trace." McReynolds choked up. "You mean the pigs are so healthy," Hayes continued, "because they've been fed more than vegetable scraps?" A heavy silence fell. Everyone knew what he meant, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Father O'Connell said heavily, "If what you're implying is true, then this is more than just murder. This is a crime so terrible that it's almost a crime to even mention it." McReynolds said hoarsely, "But what can we do? We have no evidence, only suspicion and a belt buckle that could belong to anyone." "We have to tell the sheriff," Kellerman said firmly. "This is beyond us." Hayes shook his head. "Without evidence, the sheriff can't do anything. All we have are rumors and fragments." While they were arguing, no one noticed a figure standing outside the window, blending into the night. Catherine O'Brien had followed them from the farm into town. She stood there silently listening to every word. The buckle, a careless mistake. And now she knew there were many who suspected her. In the darkness, Catherine pursed her lips, a cold smile on her face. If they thought they were hunters in pursuit, they were mistaken. Their prey was not only dangerous, but also planning a counterattack. That night, she returned to the farm. Her steps were quick, sharp, and silent. Tomorrow she would act. The doubters would never have a chance to turn their hunch into evidence. For Catherine had learned a great deal about concealment and handling. And if need be, she was fully prepared to extend her methods beyond the pigs. On September 3rd, 1847, Sheriff William Hartwell officially arrived in Harrison County after receiving a complaint from McReynolds and Hayes. Hartwell was a practical man in his 50s, with a decade of experience as a sheriff, dealing mainly with property disputes, petty thefts, and occasional neighborhood fights. When he heard about the O'Brien case, he initially dismissed it as a complicated family affair, but his professional habits meant he didn't miss a single detail. He spent the first day going through the files, talking to the people who had filed the complaint. Gradually, the inconsistencies in Catherine's story became apparent the date the deaths were paid, the letter without a postmark, the horse still in the stable. All of this added up to force him to open a formal investigation. Catherine had learned from the Irish news that the sheriff was coming 6 hours in advance. 6 hours, just enough time for her to prepare. The fire in the O'Brien's fireplace blazed fiercely, devouring what shouldn't have been there. The pig pen was cleaned up thoroughly, every little detail hidden. When Hartwell knocked on the door of the cabin the next morning, Catherine was ready. Still tired, still smiling. She invited him in, poured coffee, answered each question in a practiced tone. "Mrs. O'Brien." Hartwell set his cup down on the table, looking straight at her. "I need to ask about the large sums you paid shortly after your husband left." "About $800. Not a small sum. Can you explain where that money came from?" "I sold the pigs." Catherine replied, her hands clasped together in her lap. "Jeremiah made all the arrangements before he left, but I can find no trace of those merchants," Hartwell said sternly. "No one in Georgetown or Cynthiana has ever seen such a large pig sale. No one knows the buyer you speak of." Outwardly, Catherine remained calm. But Hartwell noticed every little movement, her hand caressing her skirt, the repetitive motion revealing a tension that words couldn't hide. "What do you think if you were Sheriff Hartwell? Would you believe Catherine? Or are those little details enough to convince you that the terrifying truth is buried right under the soil of the O'Brien farm?" They were passing through from Louisville, heading toward Lexington, Catherine explained smoothly. "I didn't think to ask for their names or businesses." Sheriff Hartwell's eyes narrowed. $800 worth of pigs represents no small matter, Mrs. O'Brien. Most farmers would remember the details of such a sale. Catherine pressed her hands together tightly in her lap, her voice quiet but steady. "I was overwhelmed, Sheriff. Jeremiah's sudden departure. I had too much to handle. I may not recall every detail perfectly." Hartwell rose from his chair and stepped toward the window. Beyond the glass, the pig pen stood in the morning sun, the animals shifting lazily in the dust. He studied them for a long moment before speaking. "Those are fine animals you've got left. Remarkably fine considering the drought this year." Catherine joined him at the window, her expression calm. "I take care of them as best I can. They're valuable breeding stock." Hartwell's voice was casual, almost conversational. "What do you feed them?" For the first time, Catherine hesitated. Just the smallest pause, but enough for the sheriff to notice. Kitchen scraps, garden waste, a little grain when I can afford it. Hartwell turned his head sharply. "And where do you purchase grain during a drought when most suppliers are running short?" I make do with what's available," she stammered, and in that instant, the sheriff saw the mask slip. Her certainty faltered. He studied her in silence for a long moment, then spoke in a low, steady tone. "Mrs. O'Brien, I'll ask you something directly, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you know where your husband is right now?" Catherine's gaze locked on his, unflinching. "He's in California, as I've told everyone, and you're certain he's alive." For a flicker of a second, was it amusement? Fear, something passed across her face. "Of course I'm certain. Why would you ask such a thing?" "Because Hartwell said," voice grave, "several people have raised concerns. And because parts of your story don't align with the evidence I've gathered." Her hands trembled slightly, hidden behind her back. What evidence? What are you suggesting, Sheriff? Hartwell reached into his coat and placed a tarnished object on the table. A belt buckle, dulled with time, but still recognizable. The initials J.O. and a Celtic knot glinted faintly in the morning light. Catherine's face drained of color. She stared at it as though it were a ghost returned to accuse her. "It could be anyone's buckle," she murmured at last. "It was found in your pig pen," Hartwell replied softly. "And it bears your husband's initials. That buckle had been buried there for months, tarnished, corroded, forgotten until now." The silence that followed was suffocating. Outside, pigs grunted and chickens scratched at the dirt, filling the gap her voice could not. Finally, her composure cracked. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't know what he was like. He was going to kill me, Sheriff. He came at me with a hay hook. He would have split my skull open. I defended myself. I had no choice." The confession poured out in a torrent, months of lies collapsing under the weight of relief. She told of Jeremiah's threats, of his rage of the night, when violence spilled over. But when Hartwell asked where the body was, she hesitated. Her eyes drifted toward the window, toward the pig pen. The sheriff followed her gaze. Realization dawned slowly, like a rising horror. His lips moved without sound. Then he whispered, "Dear God, you didn't." "They were hungry," Catherine said, her voice flat, now emptied of all pretense. "I couldn't bury him. I couldn't move him. And the pigs, they leave nothing. No bones, no teeth. Nothing that could be found later." Hartwell staggered slightly, his hand bracing against the table. In all his years, he had seen killings born of passion, greed, desperation. But this was something else. "How many people know?" he asked finally. "No one," Catherine whispered. "Just you and me." But she knew even as the words left her mouth that she was finished. The law would not forgive. And when Hartwell reached for his handcuffs, desperation surged within her. She lunged for the carving knife on the table. The sheriff reacted faster. He seized her wrist, twisting it behind her back with the seasoned strength of a man who had restrained many before her. Catherine struggled once, twice, then sagged, all fight gone. "Catherine O'Brien," Hartwell said. "Formally, you are under arrest for the murder of your husband, Jeremiah O'Brien." As the iron cuffs snapped closed, Catherine turned her head toward the pig pen one last time. The animals watched, their dark eyes glinting in the light. She thought she could almost hear them grunting softly, as though bidding her farewell. The trial opened October 15th, 1847. The courthouse in Cynthiana could barely contain the throngs who had come, some out of curiosity, others for the sheer spectacle of what the papers had already called the most shocking crime in Kentucky's history. Catherine's confession left little mystery. She had killed her husband, she claimed in self-defense, and then fed his body to her pigs. Prosecutor Samuel Morrison wasted no time. His voice thundered in the packed hall. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are not here to decide if Jeremiah O'Brien was a kind husband. We are here because his wife committed an act so depraved, so monstrous, that it mocks the very idea of civilized life." On the defense, young Robert Brennan, a lawyer of Irish descent, himself rose to defend her. He spoke passionately of Jeremiah's cruelty, of a woman driven to defend her own life in a land that offered her no protection. "My client is no monster," he told the jury. "She is a survivor. She fought for her life when the law and society gave her no shield." Everything that followed was desperation actions of a woman abandoned and afraid. But Brennan's words were a fragile shield against the tide of prejudice. Catherine was Irish a woman, and the method she had chosen to hide her crime was too ghastly to ignore. The courtroom buzzed, the crowd whispered, and the jury listened with stone faces. And dear listener, imagine yourself seated there in that sweltering courthouse in 1847. What would you have thought? Could you have seen Catherine as a desperate wife fighting for survival, or only as the woman who fed her husband to pigs? The trial lasted just 4 days, but in that short span, the courtroom in Cynthiana became a stage for some of the most haunting testimony Kentucky had ever heard. Witnesses lined up one after another. Father O'Connell described his repeated visits to the O'Brien farm, his unease growing with every strange fire, every evasive answer Catherine gave. Patrick Kellerman spoke of the nightmares his children suffered after hearing voices from the O'Brien property, sounds like whispers carried on the wind. Hayes and McReynolds recounted their suspicions and the belt buckle that had led them to call in the sheriff. But the testimony that silenced even the most hardened courtroom regulars came from Dr. Edmund Carrilla, a physician from Lexington. He had been asked to examine Catherine's pigs. These animals, he told the jury, his voice low but unwavering, show clear signs of having consumed large quantities of fresh meat. Their extraordinary size and health cannot be explained by kitchen scraps alone. In my professional opinion, the diet they received over many months is consistent with the consumption of an adult human being. A hush fell. The words struck like a hammer. Everyone knew what he was implying. Catherine herself took the stand on the final day. She did not falter. She described Jeremiah's drinking, his cruelty, his threats the moment when he raised a hayhook to end her life. "I didn't plan to kill him," she said steadily. "I wanted only to live. But once he was dead, I knew no one would believe me. A woman has no rights here, least of all an Irish woman. I would have been hanged no matter what I said." When asked about the disposal of Jeremiah's body, her eyes filled with tears. "I did what I had to do to survive. I'm not proud, but I will not apologize for choosing life over death." The jury deliberated less than 2 hours. Their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Foreman James Caldwell read the words with visible disgust, and several jurors would not meet Catherine's eyes. Judge William Petton delivered the sentence: death by hanging, scheduled for November 30th, 1847. His words carried the weight of both law and personal judgment. Catherine O'Brien, this court acknowledges that you may have acted first in defense of your life. But what followed, your deliberate disposal of your husband's body, marks a depravity that this court cannot excuse. You have placed yourself beyond the bounds of Christian burial and civilized society. Catherine showed no outward reaction. Only those seated closest noticed her trembling hands as shackles were fastened once more. Outside, the gathered crowd erupted in a storm of voices, some jeering, others murmuring with horrified fascination. On the eve of her execution, Father O'Connell visited her cell. He offered confession. For a long while, she refused. But near midnight, her resolve softened. "Do you repent of your sins, my child?" he asked softly. Catherine looked up, her eyes hard. "I repent of nothing except being born a woman in a world that gives women no protection. I killed a man who was going to kill me. If God sees that as sin, then he and I will have to settle it ourselves." The priest urged her toward forgiveness, but she would not yield. Instead, she asked one last favor. "When they hang me tomorrow, see to it that I am not cast into the potter's field. Whatever I've done, I am still a Catholic woman. I deserve consecrated ground." Father O'Connell promised to try. At dawn on November 30th, 1847, Catherine O'Brien walked to the gallows in Cynthiana's courthouse square. Nearly 500 people gathered, some from distant counties, to watch. She refused a blindfold, meeting the crowd with steady eyes. Her final words carried clear and defiant over the hushed square. "I die unrepentant for choosing life over death, survival over submission." The trapdoor fell. After the prescribed time, her body was cut down. True to his word, Father O'Connell arranged her burial in the Catholic cemetery. Her grave bore only a simple wooden cross carved with her initials. The O'Brien farm was seized and sold to pay debts. The new owners tore down the pig pen immediately, declaring the land cursed. Within years, the cabin itself collapsed, leaving only its stone foundation. But the story did not end there. Local children whispered of pig sounds echoing through the trees long after the farm lay empty. Travelers swore they glimpsed a red-haired woman feeding animals that were not there. Each new owner of the property abandoned it, claiming the air carried a weight too heavy for ordinary farming life. More than 170 years later, the land is wild again, trees and underbrush swallowing the last traces of the O'Briens. Yet, the story endures. The trial records sit in the Kentucky State Archives, just one file among hundreds. But unlike those forgotten names, Catherine's tale continues to stir unease, because it asks a question we may never fully answer. What are any of us capable of when survival itself hangs in the balance? And so I'll leave the final thought with you, dear listener. Do you believe justice was truly served that November morning in 1847? Or was Catherine O'Brien condemned less for her crime and more for who she was, a woman, an immigrant, and a survivor in a world that offered her no mercy? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story gripped you, remember to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and join me again as we uncover more forgotten mysteries from America's shadowed past.